welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll start a little slow because we've got some announcements to make, and we'll just let people kind of filter in the meantime. I should probably also verify. I see that Harmeet is here, but her camera is off. So we'll just want to make sure that she's here before we start a debate. Otherwise, don't want to kick anyone while they're down or literally not on the call. All right, so I am Richie Angel. I'm the chapter president at UCI for the UCI Federalist Society. We're very excited to be hosting this debate on free speech between Harmeet Dillon and Euron Brook. We'll tell you a little bit more about them if you're not familiar with them in a little bit, and hear what they have to say on the topic of free speech and censorship and Section 230 and all that sort of thing. Some more housekeeping, localized type of stuff first. Just a heads up that next month, at some point during the month of April, we're going to be holding chapter elections. I'm graduating. Well, this is something that we do every year, but especially right now because I'm graduating. Our Vice President Shant is also graduating. And so at some point in the very near future, I'll be sending out an email to the chapter about how that process is going to work, what positions are open, how you can nominate yourself or others, or how any of that works. So we'll send that out in the next week or two, and then at some point in April we'll hold a meeting to hold those elections. Those will not be live streamed, unfortunately. Thing is that we have our big raffle, or not a raffle, legally I can't call it a raffle, our opportunity drawing for some Amazon gift cards. So the names that are on this wheel, and I'll share my screen with you in just a second so you can see the big wheel. The names on the wheel are those from UCI who were able to register and indicate that they had an interest in participating in the drawing. We are going to pick two names. Each of those people will receive a $10 gift certificate to Amazon. And so we'll go with there. Let's go ahead and get that started. I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we will spin the magic wheel. So everyone on here has registered with us. I'm not seeing anyone on here who shouldn't be on here. I think we're good to go. So let's spin. Christy Kang, congratulations. I since I'm sharing, I can't see everyone right now, so I don't know if Christy's on the call, but we'll reach out to her either way. Congratulations, Christy. I'm gonna hide that choice, spin again, and here's our second winner. Joe. So dramatic, so exciting. What a wonderful day to be alive. So it seems like we're ready to get officially started here. We've got Euron Brook of the Ayn Rand Institute and Harmeet Dillon of the Center for American Liberty, also the Republican National Committee of California. We're very excited to have her here. Let's just make sure we've got her sound and everything working. Harmeet, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Perfect. Okay, so here's how this is going to work. We're going to be talking about free speech, which I think all of us agree is of tantamount importance in the country, but also we have some disturbing trends in media, on social media, on Amazon, on many different places of deplatforming, of censorship, of silencing, of banning, of bullying, and our values of free speech do really come to a head with these issues. It's been a very popular and contentious topic, and there are a lot of smart and well thought out arguments on both sides. I've heard both Yaron and Harmeet talk about this issue from their perspective in various fora, and I think that they're both powerhouses. That's why I wanted to reach out to them and invite them to participate with us. They are both incredible. I can't wait to get started here. Although I do have a very big issue when moderators act like they are neutral. I really don't like that. Everyone comes at things with their biases. I know that not everyone here agrees, but given that I'll be technically the moderator here today, I think it's appropriate to say that I happen to fall on the side of Euron's position on this argument. And I don't say that to sway anyone to one side or another, but in fact, the opposite. I really want people to keep me honest and make sure that they're holding my feet to the fire. And if you sense that I am being biased in my questioning or anything like that, I want you to be submitting questions as well. Send them in the private chat, send them in the public chat if you want to. Raise your hand. We can do it all sorts of ways, overly structured tonight. Um, but yeah, call me out if I'm being biased. And I think that it's important that we not pretend to be more neutral than we are. Obviously, we're all going to try to be objective, but we do come at things with our own perspective. So without further ado, we're going to start with an opening statement from Harmeet to kind of set her position. And then Yaron will have his opening statement. And then they're going to spill some blood back and forth.
Great. Well, thank you for having me here today, Richie, and all of the colleagues who are watching today. This is an issue dear to my heart. In fact, I spoke to another Federalist Society chapter this morning on the same topic. And so what I think it's fair to say that if you're being honest about people's positions, they aren't really binary. And I think if you're looking at thoughtful commentators on these issues, people often will find common ground. So I don't want this to be oversold as some sort of a debate between two opposing poles. I think you're going to find that Yaron and I have a lot of commonality in what we think, and we, certainly are going to have some differences as well. And I have good friends, people in the Federalist Society I've debated, including some professors who, don't agree with me. I happen to come from the perspective of a trial lawyer who actually represents people in court. I have to listen to these complaints, and then I have to tell people case and where is the law. So I come from this from a very practical perspective as well as a passionate First Amendment perspective. But I want to be clear as well that I don't see this issue of online censorship of internet speech as a First Amendment issue the way that the law is framed right now. That said, this is an issue about fairness. This is an issue about a government subsidy in the form of the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. This is a situation of a statute that was well-intentioned, but that has been grossly expanded to well beyond the original intention, and it is ripe for review 35 years later. And it is both sides of the political spectrum, as you'll see, who are being negatively affected by the big tech behemoths abusing this market power that they've been granted through this government subsidy, if you will, to really cheapen and downgrade our public discourse and indeed silence citizens in the most popular avenues where we communicate today. I will tell you that every day at my law firm, Dillon Law Group, and at the Center for American Liberty, the nonprofit, we get calls from citizens who have been deplatformed from social media for offenses, big and small, or even not identified altogether. We know in the recent election cycle, we saw the President of the United States taken down from Twitter. He was perhaps the most popular user of Twitter in the United States in terms of his following, and certainly one that greatly enriched the fortunes of Twitter and other big social media companies before he was removed from those platforms. We see these big tech companies affecting the outcome of elections in other countries. And I would argue that the big tech companies, through their selective censorship and blocking of certain important voices, throttling of content, putting disclaimers of this is fake news, or are you sure you want to retweet that on post, affecting the outcome of the 2020 election as well. Well, let me tell you a story about a client who I actually represented in a lawsuit against Twitter. Her name is Megan Murphy. Megan Murphy is a Canadian feminist, what trans activists would call a TERF, trans excluding radical feminist, which is a slur for somebody who believes in boys being boys and girls being girls, and it not being some kind of a thought crime or a hate crime to refer to people by their biological gender. Megan Murphy is an activist who was critical of a transgender activist in Canada who was going around and forcing immigrant women to perform waxing of his male genitalia pre-transition. Now, some of these women said, I don't want to do that. That's not what I signed up for in opening my home-based waxing salon. This man, woman, man, depending on the timing of the characterization, filed a human rights complaint in Canada, many of them against these women. So Megan Murphy is an activist who was advocating for the rights of women to control women's spaces, to control the business that women do with other women and their right to choose to do that. And at the time that Megan Murphy referred to Jessica Yaniv, a biological male, as he, or oh, it's him, it was not a violation of Twitter's terms of service to do that. Twitter has terms of service that specify the rules of the road. It's a private company. It can have the terms of service that it wants, and its terms of service specify the jurisdiction in which you can sue them, specifies a limitation of liability on damages, and specifies a host of shifting terms that you can and cannot use, and things that will get you bounced off the platform. It also specifies that if it is going to make a change to those terms of service, it will do that with 30 days notice. So what Twitter did here is, thanks to activism by trans activists, decided that dead naming or misgendering somebody was going to be a death penalty offense on Twitter, if you will. And they applied that rule change retroactively, so no 30 days of notice. And they bounced my client, Megan Murphy, radical feminist, off of Twitter permanently. No appeal, no nothing, you're done. So a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, this is a First Amendment violation. And you are smart law students at a great school. You know that's not a First Amendment violation because there's no government action. Okay, it's amazing how many people don't get that. But I said, well, that seems to be a breach of contract. Twitter's terms of service are a contract with its users. Secondly, Twitter engages in false advertising and misleading comments to the public because Twitter tells the public, come onto our platform. We let everybody come here if you just follow our rules. So we filed a lawsuit based on those two things. And I thought I had a pretty good case. I've won some lawsuits against big tech companies, many of them, in fact. But in this case, the California Superior Court in San Francisco said Communications Decency Act, Section 230, C2, is sort of a super statute that eviscerates contracts. It's like Superman. It comes in, it eviscerates contracts, blows them up. It blows through statutes, consumer protection statutes like California's Section 17200. And so, sorry, Megan Murphy, you have no rights here. Goodbye. Thanks for playing. We appealed this case to the California Court of Appeals, and their opinion was even ruder and harsher to Megan Murphy's rights. And so where we stand right now is courts have said that Twitter's contract with its users is meaningless, thanks to Communications Decency Act 230. And any promises that Twitter makes are just, haha, that's not a real thing. You can't enforce that in court. So where I come from is, I would call myself on the conservative libertarian perspective. I am deeply distrustful of the government. I am not in favor of a government agency necessarily policing people's speech on the internet. As we know, the government does most things terribly, inefficiently, and charges a lot for it. But from the point of view of consumer empowerment and consumer rights, I think consumers are being left out of this equation. You saw, some of you may have tuned into the hearings today on Capitol Hill, and yet again, I think we saw a lot of performative big tech theater on Capitol Hill with these social media giant CEOs saying mea culpa, regulate us like this, we're okay with this or that. And people pounding the table on the other side, the members of Congress, who frankly don't understand a lot of this technology or how it works. Again, these people are talking across from each other. You have lobbyist inflected choices being made. Almost all the members of Congress take money from one or the other of these big tech companies. And where are the lobbyists for the citizens? Where are the lobbyists for the speakers who rely on these promises of these companies and the contract terms? They're left out of the equation. So what I'd like to see is consumers be empowered. I would like to see finality definite contours of these laws. I would like to see weasel words like otherwise objectionable excised from Communications Decency Act 230 that allows a lot of this abuse. And I would like to see us return to, the real purpose of this act and make it much narrower and empower consumers more. So that's my perspective.
All right, thank you, Harmeet. Now let's go ahead and hear from Yaron, your opening statement, and I guess we'll reconvene to start having some back and forth after that.
Sure. Thanks, Harmeet. Really appreciate you agreeing to do this debate. Thank you, Richie, for inviting me. There's nothing more important than the protection granted us by the First Amendment for free speech. Human progress, individual happiness, every respect, a functioning, good society depends on our ability to speak freely. And it depends on there being no censorship. Now, I understand censorship, I think, differently than both Richie and Harmeet used the term. I believe that censorship is a term of force. It's a term of coercion. And therefore, a term that can only apply to government action. I don't think Twitter censors or Facebook censors. They might breach contract, and I'm not going to get into a question of breaching contract. I'm not a lawyer or legal authority to say whether they breached the contract or not. But they didn't censor. Only the government can actually silence us through the use of force, through the use of coercion. And I think using words are important, and what words we use to define specific action. Government violates our rights when it silences us. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with everything Twitter and Facebook do. Indeed, I don't agree with anything almost any private business does. I'd like Apple to do certain things better in the iPhone. I'd like Google to elevate my results higher up in the search. I'd like a lot of stuff to be different than it is. But the essence of our system of government, a system of freedom, a system of private property, is that companies are allowed to make these decisions for themselves, and we as consumers are allowed to deal with them or not. One of the things that amazes me about the complaints about Twitter and Facebook, and again, I complain about them too. I think just like I complain about some of my local restaurants, is that we ignore completely the massive benefits all of us, primarily me, I guess, receive from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and the others. I mean, I wouldn't have a business without them. I couldn't make a living the way I make a living today without these services. Before we start criticizing them, before we start condemning them, a thank you would be nice, in a sense of these platforms allow me to reach hundreds of thousands, sometimes if I'm lucky, even more than that, people, at a marginal cost of zero. I mean, I didn't think that was possible just a few years ago. The fact that we can all do that is due to these amazing big tech companies. And I think we should, before we criticize them, before we challenge them, we should acknowledge the fact that these entrepreneurs, and these are entrepreneurs, these creative, in some cases geniuses, have created an environment where we can communicate ideas in a way that we could not have imagined even just a few years ago. And we should be celebrating that, and we should be thankful for that, first and foremost. We also need to recognize that they face a difficult challenge. I mean, I know that I remember about 2 years ago, Jordan Peterson tried to create his own social media platform. I think he launched something. I don't know if it ever really, I don't think it ever really succeeded, but he tried to, and he spent many, many hours trying to figure out what would be the terms of service. Because, hey, you need terms of service. Do you want pornography on your platform? Do you want Nazis on your platform? Maybe, but maybe not. Do you want communists on your platform? I consider them the equivalent of Nazis. Do you want them on your platform? Maybe, maybe not. But these are difficult, non-obvious decisions to make. If people incite for violence, you as a platform, because of Section 230, might not be liable, but do you want them to be doing that on your platform? So These are complicated decisions. And we as consumers and as users have mixed opinions about it. I know a lot of leftists who constantly complain about Twitter silencing them on Twitter. It doesn't look like that from a libertarian perspective, from a free market perspective, but it's sure, you read Antifa and you read others, they're complaining just as bitterly as many people on the right about being excluded from some of these social media platforms. These are not easy decisions to make on how to manage this, how to proceed, who to keep on, who to take off, when to take them off, what terms of service make sense and what are not. Now, I happen to think that the terms of service that Twitter and Facebook and others use are terrible. They're non-objective, they're vague, they're ambiguous, basically gives them all the power and gives you as a consumer no power. I wish that wasn't the case. I wish they had clear-cut objectives. So I knew if I said this word, I was out. Like the what is it? There's the Communication Regulatory Agency. They've got their 7 words. If you go on radio and say one of those 7 words, they're after you. At least you know you never say those 7 words on radio or TV. It would be nice if the terms of service were clear, objective, unequivocal about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. They're not. I think at the end of the day, these social media companies will suffer the consequence of their not being, because I think alternative will arise. I think some of us will move to those alternatives. I think they'll see less business. And in the meantime, I think the sad thing is what they're going to see is more government intervention. I actually think that Section 230 is pretty good law. I think it makes complete sense that these platforms should not be liable for things said by people on their platform. Could it be improved? Maybe. I'm not a lawyer, but I'll tell you this. In the current environment, you want lobbyists and politicians to improve Section 230? Does anybody imagine we'd get a better result than what we have? Look at Facebook today. Facebook today suggested in front of Congress a so-called improvement on Section 230. They would set up a, quote, nonpartisan committee to decide which social media platform qualify under 230 and which ones don't. Oh my God. Do you really want to give the government that kind of power? Do you want some kind of committee to make those kind of decisions? Do we want Congress to make those decisions? When the Democrats, when the Republicans, when they switch every few years? Do we really want that power in the hands of... 230 might be flawed, but the alternative to me strikes me as far worse. It's like people want to institute a convention, constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution. And I have no doubt that you can improve on the Constitution and make it better. But do we really want today's politicians, today's intellectuals, today's voters to try to improve on the Constitution? What's the probability that would actually happen? I think it's 0. I think we're likely to get much worse than better. And I think the same goes for Section 230. In spite of the fact that it might not be ideal, it's probably the best that we're going to get and the best that is possible in the political environment that we have in the world today. But also, Section 230, I don't think limits competition. I don't think the current tech giants are a product of Section 230. It's the reason why they're all eager to see Section 230 modified. I think Section 230 allows for competition. It actually encourages competition. I could start a social media platform tomorrow, and anything can be said on that platform, and I, as the owner of the platform, am not liable. That's pretty cool. That allows for competition. That allows for new entrants into the market. Imagine a barrier where I have to filter through all the content that's being published on my site to make sure that it's not liable, to make sure that it's not inflammatory, to make sure that it's not opens me up to lawsuit. The beauty of 230 is it allowed communication. It's not just platform. 230 applies to the comments section at Fox News website. It applies to comment section at the New York Times. Imagine if the New York Times were liable. I mean, maybe you'd be happy. Maybe some of you would be happy because you hate the New York Times. But imagine if every media company was liable for the comments that are left by its readers at the bottom of its website. What a disaster. So I think Section 230 is about as good as we're going to get. And I think it does much more good than harm in the world in which we live. I think for the most part, it protects rights, and it protects legitimate rights, and it is a legitimate law that allows companies to basically allow for commentary on their website without being liable for anything that's said, for everything that's said on that site. I also think that those who advocate for regulating or controlling what is said or what Twitter and Facebook can and cannot do are basically encouraging or advocating for the violation of free speech. Because the fact is that Twitter has the right to free speech. In other words, the owners of Twitter have the right to free speech. They have a right to set the term of service the way they want. They have a right, if the terms of service allow it, if the contract, if you will, allows it, to kick anybody off the platform that they want, just as I have a right to kick anybody out of my house that I want. Somebody who owns a movie theater can decide what movies to play at the theater, including make political decisions. For example, when Mel Brooks makes one of his pro-religion movies, there are movie theaters that say, we don't want to play that. We're not interested in advocating for these kind of ideas by playing that movie. That is within their free speech rights, not to be forced to use their property for a purpose that they disagree with. The same is true of Twitter and Facebook. They get to decide what kind of platforms they want to be, who they host, who they let speak on their platform. It's private property. We might not like it. Many of us might want more open platforms. Great. We should build them then. And my suspicion is that they will get built. We're seeing a proliferation of platforms. Yes, we still talk about Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, but they have competition. I mean, the biggest one these days is Clubhouse, right? That's come out of nowhere, didn't exist a year ago, and is gaining momentum significantly. Now, it was founded by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, so is it going to be a little left biased? Of course. That's where Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are. So to the extent that their companies reflect their ideology, it's going to be all over the place. If people on the right or people with free market ideas would like to create different platforms, great. Let competition thrives and let it happen. So I would like to see less controls. I'd like to see the government stay out of it. I personally consider it a travesty that CEOs of big tech are invited in front of Congress. A bunch of unproductive idiots who don't understand the technology get to sit and look down on some of the most productive people we have in the world today, creating the technology of the future, employing hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, the ignorance and the stupidity of the Congress people's questions is stunning. And the fact that they won't let the executives answer the questions, right? As soon as there's an intelligent answer coming across, I'm gonna cut you off now. I'm gonna take my time back or whatever. They don't. They don't ask questions to expect answers. They ask questions in order to express virtue signaling, and it's a travesty. It's a travesty. I mean, if we want to add laws, there should be a law that sets a very, very high threshold before any American CEO is forced to testify in front of the clowns that constitute our Congress today. Thank you.
For your opening statements. We'll toss it back to Harmeet now to respond to anything you'd like from Euron's opening statement, but I'd also like to pose a question at the same time, and hopefully we'll kind of see what you how you can tie this all together. But Yaron said something that really struck me as interesting, which is whether reform for Section 230 is realistic, or if it is reformed, what would that look like, and how realistic is it, or how much should we expect that it will come out the way we want? You mentioned excising the catch-all or any other offensive content or whatever it says at the end there in Section 230. And I believe Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee recently proposed doing just that on the floor. but particularly with a Democratic-controlled Congress and a Democratic White House, what do you think Section 230 reform would actually look like? Are your proposals realistic in this climate?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I think Euron comments included the idea that we have no problem in competition here and that Clubhouse is some kind of competitor to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, which of course is nonsense. It is not. And the closest example of a competitor to one of these truly giant mega tech companies was Parler. And I say was because you actually don't have a right to compete where I love the way that libertarians somehow sneer at people who are seeking a more common ground and accountability for these big tech companies by saying, you don't like it, build your own corporation, build your own Twitter, build your own Facebook. And so Parler tried to do exactly that. But these companies have become so big because of a lack of antitrust enforcement, which is a topic for another day, that in fact, there was no real estate for them to build that business on. They built it on Amazon servers. Amazon kicked them off. Apple and Google kicked them off of their app stores. For what crime? Today's hearings and the testimony put forward by these companies demonstrates that of all of these big tech companies and the January 6th events that Democrats are still screaming about in Congress and trying to pass laws to take away our guns, it was Parler that made the most references, or sort of per capita of number of users, to the federal authorities regarding violations or potential violence that was being transmitted on its site. And it's these other companies that have turned a blind eye to a lot of the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the terrorism organizing that happens on these platforms and otherwise. And so what are you left with? The competitors are being crushed by the oligarchs, and we do not have anything close to a free market. We have a very sclerotic market dominated by left-wing viewpoints with very little exception. In terms of what I think the reform should be, my view is not changed on what the reform should be based on us having the White House and the Senate and the House in 2017, where our Republican side totally failed at the job of doing what they could to reform this now 35-year-old law. I think that the one issue that I mentioned is an important one. Law enforcement authorities, United States Department of Justice, have said that these big tech companies have been non-cooperative with respect to human trafficking, sex trafficking, terrorism. So these criminal offenses, I would potentially rewrite CDA 230 Section C's caption. Section C's caption posits the concept of a good Samaritan carve-out. Department of Justice, I often disagree with the Department of Justice, but I think in the particular viewpoint of changing that concept to be really singling out the bad actors and have enforcement regime on bad Samaritans, a common ground where we can all agree. If there's a court order that a company has notice of regarding some illegal conduct of stalking or some other type of issue that's illegal, defamation, where you have evidence from a court order or some kind of objective indicia that there is something improper about the conduct, and of course, these trafficking situations. So I think those are some of the reforms I would have. I also am a fan of sunset provisions in much federal law and regulation. And this is a law that's been out there for 35 years. It isn't a super statute. I don't know how it got to be elevated to the status of some of our most revered laws. It's been around for a little bit of time, and it was passed to resolve a specific problem where nascent big tech companies were being punished for being family friendly, for filtering the content. They got punished if something managed to squeeze through. So also, I would say that the current language of CDA 230 includes a concept of good faith. However, courts are not enforcing or importing any type of good faith analysis into their enforcement. It is a carte blanche. Anytime a big tech company says, hey, Section 230, I win, the court's like, okay, that's cool. For example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, minutes after a resolution was introduced by a fellow member of Congress that she should be bounced out of Congress. Wow, coincidentally, minutes later, Twitter takes down her whole account for what? For a fake violation that she didn't commit. Then 12 hours later, they said, oh yeah, that was a mistake. Nobody believes, who's being honest here, that that was a mistake or a coincidence. That was not good faith. That was bad faith. Today in the hearing, the founder of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, admitted that the sort of blackout of the New York Post reporting on Hunter Biden's shenanigans with, drugs and his laptop and what have you, that was a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. Wow, how did that mistake happen? They have in this city of San Francisco, thousands of well-paid employees who are paid to make those decisions. And that mistake went on for days. So it's convenient to say that in front of Congress right now, but there is no good faith in the way these companies are applying their decided political bias, ignoring the words of their own contracts, ignoring the words of the statute, and there are judges and, of course, politicians who are complicit. Do I like the crew of politicians we have? I think they're feckless. I think they're awful. And even as a Republican, I would trade in 80% of them for some better ones, frankly. But it is how legislation is made. And if you ask the citizens in the Athenian Agora what they thought about those guys running them, they would say the exact same thing. So yes, the people who are governed are usually resentful and disdainful of the governed, but this is our system. So just like we don't like where the road is going, that doesn't mean we don't have roads altogether. We have to try and we have to do our best. And I don't think there's anything sacrosanct about the language of CDA 230. The concept is a good one, but the language is not working for us right now.
Yaron, go ahead and respond to that any way you'd like. I particularly enjoyed those points about Parler being taken off of Amazon servers, as well as Harmeet's thoughts on the good faith provision and whether we really are seeing good faith from people like Jack Dorsey when there are these repeated accidental violations or accidental deplatformings or things like that. What do you have to say?
Well, I'd say with regard to Paula, Paula is suing Amazon. It's a contractual issue. We will see. We'll see what the courts decide. I don't have the context to be as skeptical of the courts as Harmeet has. Maybe she's right. I don't know. But, I just don't have the context to have an opinion. But it's a contractual dispute. Amazon claims that they warned Paula several times, that they indicated what it would take in order to fit with the contract that they had. Paula refused to make the changes. Amazon dumped them. Paula claims, no, none of that happened. A court at least turned down an injunction from Paula to try to get this, to reverse the Amazon decision. We'll see when it goes to court what actually happens and what actually turns out to be. But it's a contractual issue. The fact is, we can't only like property rights and contract law when it goes the way we want it. The whole idea of freedom is that sometimes, contracts, companies make decisions that we don't like. But they are free to do so. That's what it means to be free. It means that people make decisions that you might not like, that you might want reversed. But unless you have legal recourse, and maybe Paula does and maybe Paula doesn't, we'll see. Paula's still around. They're still fighting. We'll see. It surprises me a little bit about Paula is that they didn't know this was coming. I mean, they're not the first one to try to be turned away from some of these. I mean, if you remember Gab about a year and a half earlier, and while there's Paula, in the meantime, has found a cloud service provider to host them. You'd think they'd have a backup plan just in case Amazon dropped them. But those are business decisions. That's my point. These are not free speech issues. These are business decisions. In terms of Jack Dorsey, I would go back again to this point. And I know as bystanders, everything looks easy. As bystanders who've never run a company of thousands of people, who've never tried to filter information and decide what you should have and what you shouldn't, and what your standards are going to be. Never had to manage a bunch of people who do have, there's no question. Silicon Valley has a leftist agenda, and the stunning thing about Silicon Valley leftist agenda is most of them don't even know they're leftist. That is, they think this is just the truth. They think they're centrists. They think they can't imagine an alternative position to their own. That's the reality. And, that's part of what you're managing. The decision, for example, to deplatform Trump, there was massive internal debate within Twitter. And Jack Dorsey was overridden by his staff. He did not want to deplatform Trump from all accounts, from the email trails, but he was convinced, cajoled by staff to do it. Now, I happen to, if nothing else, I like the fact that we live in a country where the president of the United States can be deplatformed by a private company. I think that's cool. You couldn't do that in China, can't do that in Iran, you can't do that in any authoritarian state. For a private company to say, no, the president of the United States can't be on our platform, is not invited to our house. I think it's kind of cool that we still live in a country where that is possible. So I think the situation with Paula, we'll have to see what happens. We'll have to see how it develops. Did these companies violate their contracts or didn't they? But it's a contractual issue. There's no free speech issue unless, and here's a big caveat, if it turns out that Amazon got a phone call from a government official telling them, shut Paula down or we're coming after you, like Trump tried to do to Amazon several times, by insinuating that he would go after Amazon if the Washington Post didn't behave itself. If that was going on, then that's the violation of the First Amendment. That's government action. That's government influencing a company to silence somebody. If it turns out that a government official called up Twitter or Facebook and said, deplatform X, that's a violation of free speech. That's where I'd like to see the government involved. But other than that, government should stay out of this. Let the courts deal with the contractual issues. Let the courts deal with whether there were real violations here of contract law. None of this applies to free speech, not to the First Amendment in any way, not to the right of free speech. It does relate to a culture, and that is, what kind of culture do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a culture where these big platforms deplatform large numbers of people? And my answer is no, I don't want to see it happen. I don't want to see a lot of people being deplatformed. I don't want to see a lot of people go away. I'd like to have the robust discussion. Let good ideas win and let the bad ideas disappear. Not because somebody deplatformed them, but because they're bad ideas and nobody follows them anymore. So culturally, I'd love to see more openness on the side of the social media, and I'd like to see them more objective about their standards. But this is not a place for government action. I overall think that Section 230 of all the laws out there is pretty good law. Yeah, it might be loose in certain places and needs to be tightened, but I guess I don't trust our existing politicians to tighten the language in a way that will not do more harm than good. I think that what 230 has allowed is, instead of every time somebody posts something obnoxious on one of these social media platforms, that it goes to court and a court decides what they should and shouldn't do, and who knows, different courts would decide different things. You're trying to build a national platform. This made the internet in the way that we have it today. I disagree with Harmeet completely with regarding competition. I mean, all these companies are brand new. Most of them didn't exist 10 years ago, weren't big 10 years ago. They replaced other companies that we thought would be there forever. In 10 years, will there be different companies that we're worried about? Almost certainly. I don't know what those companies are. I wish I did. I would be investing right now. Silicon Valley is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in creating competition for Amazon and for Facebook and for Twitter and for others. Most of those companies will fail. Some of them will succeed. That's the beauty of a market. And I'm not going to get into antitrust now, but let me just say this, just to give my perspective on antitrust. I can't think of more immoral law, a law that should be abolished completely, than antitrust law. I think it's the most non-objective. Talk about Section 230. Antitrust should be gone from the 1890 law all the way to all the modifications later on. It's an abomination. It's anti-American. It's anti-capitalist, and it's anti-freedom.
Well, antitrust certainly sounds like a great topic for another day, like Harmeet said.
That would be fun.
I would remind everyone that you're free to submit questions questions. I'm going to continue to pose questions, but I would love to hear from you what you would like to hear from Harmeet and Yaron. I'm going to toss it back to Yaron really quick. I wanted to push back on something you brought up earlier. So you're making a very hard line distinction between the law of free speech and the culture of free speech. And that's certainly, from a legal standpoint, a correct distinction to make, like your point earlier about censorship as well. However, there is a culture that is against free speech. At what point should we become concerned that a growing movement against free speech becomes large enough that, when we've seen many times throughout history, majorities can have very bad ideas and collectively believe in horrible things and do horrible things through government action, and override their constitutional protections. So at what point should we become so concerned about this culture that is anti-free speech that the government has to step in before it is powerless to defend itself?
We should be worried every single day. Certainly we should be worried today in a world of kind of cancel culture, in a world of deplatforming, in a world in which there are things that are just not tolerated, where you can lose your job for saying a word, even if it's completely in a different context than what the offense was intended. The whole thing, free speech, in terms of a culture of free speech, we are in worrisome territory. This is one of the reasons, and by the way, left and right, I consider Trump as one of the most anti-free speech presidents ever, culturally, not legally. He didn't do anything legally, but culturally, in the way he spoke about the issue. I consider the left an abomination when it comes to free speech, culturally. I think that free speech, Ted Cruz, in wanting to heavily regulate Facebook and Twitter, is a threat to free speech. So I think across the political aisle, left and right, we are seeing a real building up of a coalition that is anti-free speech. And I think the beginning will be with Section 230, which I think will be turned into something much worse than it is today, that limits speech, not liberates speech. And I think it will come in the form of regulating social media, which I think would be a disaster. And it's ultimately, we will test kind of the issues of hate speech, which I think is destroying Europe right now, the idea of the existence of hate speech. Hate speech is protected speech. And now I think that constitutionally, we are still in a pretty good place. I think, there are enough judges out there who have a respect for the First Amendment and a respect for the protection of the First Amendment that we're fairly safe. But it's under attack. And culturally, we need to be vigilant in defending it. In many respects, legally, free speech is better defended now, protected now than it ever has been. And remember, it was under attack from day one. I mean, John Adams with the Sedition Act, started us off with an attempt to restrict speech, and we've really been fighting for it since then. And I think that fight needs to continue, and it needs to be focused on the real threat. And the real threat is government action. That's the real threat. All this stuff culturally, we need to fight culturally. The threat of government action, we need to fight politically. That's the separation we need to have.
All right, so let's go back to Harmeet to respond to that really fast, and particularly those last points that Yaron was making about free speech, at least legally, is better protected now than it ever has been. Is this something that we're kind of overblowing? And then also, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are if, you're certainly by no means proposing for government action. I don't think any of us would say that, right? You've talked about being conservative and libertarian and some government action maybe, but not, a total statist takeover of social media. But assuming it's not the right means to handle any of these issues, what are some things that we should be focusing on to curb the cultural free speech debate that we're seeing right now? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of both of those things. How can we be focusing culturally with or without the government recourse that we're also taking, as well as is free speech really as protected as Yaron says it is?
Well, I think Euron is there's a bit of a shell game here. On the one hand, we've all agreed at the beginning of this debate, as so to speak, that we're not talking about the First Amendment. I think the First Amendment is robust protection for people vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis frivolous lawsuits designed to chill people's speech in the public square. I won or defeated several anti-SLAPP lawsuits so far this year, motions this year. So that means we have a robust, effective system. Sometimes the courts get it wrong, but generally the consumer can walk into court and get their day in court. What we're talking about here is different. And I don't worship corporations like some libertarians. Corporations are a fiction of the government. They're created by government action, and shareholders of corporations get immunity from individual liability in exchange for certain regulations and following certain rules. So the idea that, we're talking about destroying some tiny flower that needs to grow is nonsense. I mean, as Yaron was talking about how we should be grateful for these big tech companies and how hard their job is, I felt like playing a tiny violin for the tech companies and how hard their job is. Look, do not feel sorry for the big tech companies. Heavily capitalized, yes, their abuse of monopoly power to crowd out competition in terms of Google in search, in browser, in telephone, in collection of our data, and in YouTube, by far the largest video streaming channel. They have market power, not just to crowd out competition, but to affect the outcome of elections, not just in other countries, but in our countries as well. And so my concern is really with the consumer. And what I would like to see is a consumer-focused orientation on these laws, a consumer bill of rights, consumers having the ability to go into court and sue these tech companies when they transgress outside certain clearly defined lines. Right now, consumers have virtually no power. They don't have the power to go to a competitor to Twitter because there isn't one. The Facebook situation, Facebook is, I think, to be fair, trying to be a good citizen more than some of these others, and trying to, create certain norms and color within certain lines, but they're not getting it right. And so the politicians who passed CDA 230 in 1996, they weren't any better. They were not like, George Washington or something. They were not any better than the people who are governing us today. They were just different people. The world has changed. The technology has, nobody thought there was going to be a social media company called Twitter, Facebook, Google, or even Clubhouse or any of those. They were not even a twinkle in the eye of these legislators. These legislators were worried about grandma trying to send photographs over Prodigy or what have you, and the dial-up services censoring them, and what happens, and can there be a family-friendly version of AOL? Like completely foreign concepts to all of the law students who are watching this today. So technology has moved on. The world has moved on. These companies have become to dominate politics and even affect the outcome of elections around the world. You can't criticize India, the world's biggest democracy right now. There's 75 million people protesting in a farmers' protest over there. But India has asked Twitter to censor its critics on social media. This is really dangerous. So we are getting beyond the realm of corporations and their rights and into what this censorship that these companies are doing, yes, it is censorship, is doing to our freedoms in the world. And I think that's worthy of discussion. I think there is no accountability, there's no balance, and literally no citizen can go into court these days and have a successful cause of action against these companies for being falsely labeled purveyors of fake news, for being called people who are fomenting riots or what have you, and being taken down because they quote unquote participated in these June 6 riots. If New York Times said that about me, I'm Harmeet Dillon, participated in the riots, and that's why we're not quoting her anymore in our publication. I could sue them for that because I have a cause of defamation against them because that's false. But if Twitter takes you down because of that, they say, we're not allowing Harmeet Dillon to have an account on Twitter anymore because Harmeet causes harm because she said something about January 6th. I can't sue Twitter for that. That would also be false. I was nowhere near those events. I didn't support them. And yet that has happened to many Americans today. So I'm in favor of greater consumer rights. I'm in favor of any statute we have on the books, be it regarding the First Amendment, regarding speech, regarding government action or whatever, having clearly defined terms, no weasel words, no fudge factor, nothing that lobbyists can, sort of massage and what have you. So that's where I am. I mean, the reality of why we haven't had CDA 230 reform over the years is because of the power of these big tech companies, because all of them, Republican or Democrat, they're all posturing in Congress today. Almost all of them take money from these big tech companies and their lobbyists. All of the think tanks in DC, 95% of them take money from these big tech companies and their lobbyists. And that's why you have the inertia and apathy on the changes of the law that should have happened that have not. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Harmeet. So we've got about 5 minutes before we want to finish up here. So we're going to enter lightning round territory. I've got.
And by the way, I do have a hard stop coming up because I've got a TV hit after this. So sorry.
Okay, absolutely. So lightning round. We do have an audience question, which is directed to Harmeet. So we're going to toss this question to Harmeet for a quick response. Toss it back to Yaron for a quick response to Harmeet's response, and then back to Harmeet for a closing statement if you would like to give one very briefly, and then Yaron for the same.
I probably don't have time. Sorry, I only have 2 minutes left because I only budgeted an hour for this. So
okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So we'll toss
yeah.
you this question, and then you just cut out as soon as you have to. We understand the commitment.
And
Thank you.
You can continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. All right. So the question is 2 parts. First, how did Section 230 get to its preeminence as a super statute, or at least perceived super statute, as you called it? And then second, aside from statutory reform, do you see a future where judicial interpretation addresses some of the issues you've addressed? And what sort of changes might we see there?
Right. Good question. So how did CDA 230 get to be a sacred cow of the corporate world? The answer is lobbyists, and they buy politicians, and politicians then pound the table and don't act. It's very effective. Very few lobbying dollars are required to buy a United States congressman and get them to change their viewpoint on your view. In some cases, you could tell a senator who was opposed to big tech abuses, we're going to put Google Fiber in your neighborhood where your kids go to school, and boom, they changed their position on the whole situation. And so judicial reform, it ain't happening, okay? Without a change in the law and the words of the statute and some clear signal from the legislature that these abuses are inconsistent with the terms of the statute, nothing is happening. And trust me, I'm a lawyer who's gone into court and tested this numerous times, and I've spoken to every lawyer just about who's taken these tech companies on. And the courts have followed this trend because early decisions said CDA 230 means you can do whatever you want, and the language is very sloppy. Otherwise objectionable gives the big tech companies just a giant exception to do whatever they want. So I'm sorry I have to cut out early, but I've got another commitment. So thank you for having me today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Yaron for a thoughtful discussion.
Thanks, Harmeet.
All right.
Thank you very much, Harmeet. Have fun with that commitment you've got over there. That's excellent. I've really appreciated the points that you've made today. All right, so let's toss it back to Yaron for a really quick closing statement, I guess, keeping in mind that we will be held accountable to Harmeet and her followers as well in her absence. So let's be as fair to her as possible. But very briefly, if you could sum up what we've learned today, anything you'd like to say at closing?
Sure. I mean, I find it troubling, and I think this is much more of a troubling cultural phenomena than I think the speech issue. The hostility that both people on the left and on the right these days have towards business. Business is what built this country. Business is what created this country. Those evil monopolists, those evil robber barons, so-called evil, are the people who really made this country what it is. And it's striking to me that every generation of great entrepreneurs has to fight off. And yes, I know the violins are going, but I think they deserve our thanks. They deserve our appreciation as an act of justice, given what they've contributed to our lives. I think big tech has made our lives great. We complain about Google, yet the product we get from them, it was unimaginable in the past and is available for us for free. The same with Facebook, the same with Twitter. Yes, they're not perfectly run. Yes, we have complaints about what they do. Yes, I'd like to see a different attitude of the culture towards speech. But that's exactly why this separation of culture from the law is exactly why I don't want to see politicians engaged. the market power and the idea that Google or any of these companies, win elections is just stunning to me. We have, as individuals, as consumers, more options today to get our news and our information from than any generation in all of human history. I'd like to give the example of when Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980. There were 3 channels, maybe 4 if you count PBS, that conveyed all the news to Americans: ABC, CBS, NBC, all left. There were 5 major newspapers, among them New York Times, Washington Post, all left. There was no talk radio, dominated by the right, by the way. There was none. There was no Fox. There was no internet. There were no blogs. There was nothing else. It was a desert. The entire media apparatus was in the hands of the left. Ronald Reagan still won, right? Because Americans are not brainwashed by their media. They're not brainwashed by Twitter. They're not brainwashed by Facebook. We're intelligent enough to make our own decisions. Sometimes we make bad decisions, but to blame Twitter and Facebook for election results you don't like, I think is wrong. And it really is an evasion of the richness and the diversity of the media platforms we have today. We have more access to more diverse media than ever. We should celebrate that. And our speech is protected better than ever. I mean, think about the fact that Lenny Bruce in the 1960s went to jail for saying the F word. Now, I don't say the F word not because I fear going to jail, but just I don't say it in polite company, right? But that's a big improvement. Think about Citizens United. Now, I'm not sure how Harmeet would think about Citizens United, but think about Citizens United freeing up a whole realm of free speech. So I think we're in a good position vis-a-vis the law, in a bad position vis-a-vis the culture. We need to fight on the cultural front by engaging in more dialogue and debate and discussion and emphasizing the importance of listening to ideas you don't agree with, because that's part of how you learn.
Wonderful words to end on. We certainly value listening to opinions you don't agree with here at the Federalist Society. So on behalf of the Federalist Society at UCI, I want to thank everyone who participated today, especially our 2 wonderful guest debaters, Euron Brook and Harmeet Dillon. And thank you to everyone for being here. This has been a wonderful, wonderful event, and I hope that we all learned a lot and heard a lot of things that we can think about, and that we continue this engaging debate civilly on various platforms that we may find it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, but it's been a blast to have everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Richie.